Welcome to today's panel on the theme of blue helmets and A4P, the future of peacekeeping. I'm Richard Ponzio at the Stimson Center, where I direct the Global Governance, Justice, and Security program. And my colleagues and I are truly thankful and excited to be part of PeaceCon at 10. Hope you all enjoyed the opening session over the past 90 minutes. Before I introduce our exceptional panelists for today's session, we'll aim to make this, of course, as dynamic and interactive as possible. Let me say a few words about our thematic focus. The blue helmets, or UN peacekeepers, have been one of the organization's most effective tools in maintaining international peace and security. As the qualitative and quantitative evidence assembled by Professor Lise Howard at Georgetown University and other leading scholars demonstrates, peacekeeping is working. There are clear correlations, for instance, between peacekeeping on the one hand and less civilian death, less violence, less spread of conflict, less gender-based violence, and more robust post-conflict institutions on the other hand. Yet peacekeeping is facing many acute challenges, and as we'll discuss today, no doubt you're aware of many of these challenges, including the fact that there hasn't been a new peacekeeping mission by the UN initiated in the past 8 years. In 2018, Secretary General António Guterres launched the Action for Peacekeeping, or A4P, which aims to renew commitments to peacekeeping and create operations fit for the future. The UN Secretariat continues to advance peacekeeping reform in cooperation with member states and regional organizations through what is now called the A4P Plus. With this as our backdrop, our 5 panelists will examine the future of peacekeeping, with at least 2 of our panelists offering a field-based country-level perspective. They will also consider how current and emerging global security and political trends might shape peacekeeping operations going forward, and what concrete action the international community can take to further reform and strengthen peacekeeping as a tool capable of rising to these new challenges. All of our panelists' detailed bios can be found on this amazing web-based platform for PeaceCon. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to share their current titles, and this is in the order that we'll have some lead-off questions posed to each of them. First, we're very fortunate to have with us Dr. Bakary Sambe, who is the Executive Director of the Timbuktu Institute African Center for Peace Studies and an Assistant Professor at the Center for the Study of Religions at Gaston Berger University in Senegal. Next, we'll hear from my colleague Lisa Charlin, who is a Senior Fellow and Director of the Protecting Civilians in Conflict program at the Stimson Center here in Washington, D.C., and she's recently arrived back at Stimson from her native Australia. After Lisa, we'll hear from Hardin Lang, who is Vice President for Programs and Policy at Refugees International and has served in several UN peace operations. Next, we'll hear from my colleague Banu Arjuman, who is a Research Assistant with the Global Governance, Justice, and Security program at the Stimson Center. And finally, we'll hear from Daniel Levine-Spown, who is a peacekeeping researcher for the Center for Civilians in Conflict, or CIVIC, where he covers the Democratic Republic of the Congo and South Sudan. For our sessions format, we're going to begin with brief questions posed to each of our speakers, giving 5 to 7 minute responses. As I said, though, we're going to have time for lots of interaction with each of you. So start thinking about questions you may wish to pose to our esteemed panelists. If there's only a few questions being posed, we're going to encourage that you come onto screen and share them directly with our panelists. But we're going to make this as interactive and hopefully enjoyable for all participating today. So let's get started. And first off, Bakary, with your experience on the ground in West Africa and in particular Mali, what are some of the challenges facing Manusma, the UN peacekeeping mission in Mali? And at the same time, what are 1 or 2 areas where you feel the mission Manusma is performing well? And we're hoping you can refer to your research that we know is going deep on the issue of local perspectives being reflected in the UN's work, and in particular, sensitivity to the role of religious and tribal leaders in local peace-building level engagements of the United Nations. Bakary, welcome. Oh, and please kindly turn off mute and so that we can hear you.
Okay, I'm okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for your invitation. and thank you, dear colleague. I think that in the countries of West Africa and the Sahel, the role of religious leaders is increasingly recognized by local population for initiative to consolidate peace and promote the values of tolerance and justice. But despite this approach, often scattered, there is still a real lack of understanding of the mechanism by international partners who do not understand the meaning and importance of such intervention at the local level. However, as you can see, these interventions by religious leaders concern fields as various as mediation, the resolution of inter-community conflict, and traditional justice. And in this regard, for example, in Mali, when you have the Qadi is the local judge, the traditional or religious judge. They play a very important role guaranteeing some form of access to justice in certain communities in Mali and beyond. According to a report we have published in 2018, 17% of those polled were not familiar with the formal justice system, which only 27% use the formal justice. This reluctance in the face of institutional judicial mechanism was explained by notably cultural reason. For cultural reason, they trust to the informal justice, and they trust to the religious leaders. And those people tend to regard the state's justice system as a solution of last resort, an informal arrangement being frequently preferred to a formal judgment. There is, and I think that this latter remark can be useful with the current situation in central Mali, where Manusma can experience how to have a kind of mixed system, valorizing the traditional indigenous resources to solve to for mediation, and also gradually try to see how to include in the justice system some element from the traditional rulers, from the traditional and religious teaching, which are meaningful for population. Because I think that you cannot do anything efficient on the ground if what you are doing is not meaningful for the local population, in order to avoid what I call the conflict of the perception of the conflict. We have to fill this gap by more attention to understand the local realities and try to include this local reality in our conception and our analysis of the conflict and the context where we are trying to settle any kind of peacekeeping.
Great. No, thank you so much. And especially this new term I'm learning, which I'm sure sounds great in French as well, which I know is your preferred first language, conflict of the perception of the conflict when understanding local perspectives in a peacekeeping context. And, you know, pulling out from the local, you have, of course, being in Dakar, looking at things regionally, ECOWAS is a major peace making player in the context of Mali, making some important statements just in the last few weeks. If you could share what ECOWAS has done, but really we're looking at the through the prism of making UN peacekeeping more effective. How has the UN collaboration been with ECOWAS and, of course, the other key player, the African Union?
As we know, ECOWAS now is really concerned by the situation in the region. We have the situation in Mali, in Guinea, and yesterday or this week in Burkina Faso. And first, I think that, and it is my conviction, that it is important to understand that there is a conflict of perception concerning the Manusma. Malians have difficulty to understand that the mission does not include the fight against terrorist movement. I believe that an evolution is desirable on the part of most Malian actors with whom I often exchange. They say that we need to adapt the MINUSMA functioning. without going so far as to ask for a Chapter 7. The mission cannot continue to enjoy the support of the Malian people if it does not reform or evolve by adapting to the realities on the ground. I think that Manusma, being an emanation of international legality with a certain legitimacy from the United Nations, could accelerate the handling of security challenges by ECOWAS and the African Union. If, for example, if it is even its interest, because its mission will no longer be perceived as an incursion by a foreign country via international system, but rather as a real support for the capacity building and strengthening of the continental anchoring of organizations such as the African Union and ECOWAS, in spite of their shortcomings and constraints, as you can imagine. And I think that we need an evolution for the MINUSMA mission, because people on the ground cannot understand that in Mali, where the major concern is the fight against the terrorist group, and this mission is not included in the MINUSMA one. The other thing is, I think that ECOWAS, in spite of all the problems, need to be included. And this last year, we have some confusion where people do not understand why we have the G5 Sahel, which is the main tool that the international system use, neglecting the ECOWAS role. I think that with the crisis, with the combination of institutional crisis in Mali and also security crisis in the northern part of the country and in central Mali, we have a new opportunity for a synergy between the MINUSMA, ECOWAS, and African Union in order to make this possible, this evolution, which is a social demand from the Malians themselves and from all people in the region, we cannot understand really the reason why this important mission from the United Nations is not involved in fighting terrorism or to help the Mali, for example, to fight the terrorist group. I think that this evolution is really necessary, and it is a kind of social demand from the Malian population.
Thank you, Bakari. As people are aware, I'm sure a very informed audience, that the UN has been involved in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, countries at the heart of the war on terror the last 2 decades. But the first major peacekeeping operation normally associated with counterterrorism is the Mali MINUSMA mission, and work across the Sahel region. You mentioned the G5, the Francophone countries from West Africa throughout the Sahel, engaged in a joint counterterrorism effort, working with ECOWAS. We're going to come back to some of these themes because they could have a lot to do with this overarching theme of our panel, the future of peacekeeping. And to take a step back and look globally and the evolution of peacekeeping, I asked my colleague Lisa to help us with thinking through one of the 3 core principles of peacekeeping, is that missions deploy with the consent of the main parties to the conflict. The importance of this cooperation with host countries has been reiterated as part of this A4P plus that we're discussing today. Yet in several deployed UN peacekeeping missions, there have been instances where the host country interferes with or obstructs the implementation of the mission mandate. We might come back to that in connection with Mali. Is this a new challenge, though, and how do we address it?
Thanks so much for that introduction, Richard, and it's a pleasure to be part of PeaceCon today. It's a really interesting question, and it's one that we're looking at as part of some research that we have underway at Stimson at the moment. As you noted at the outset there, this is one of the main principles of peacekeeping operations, and for the benefit of the audience, which is very well informed, but for those who may not be as familiar with peacekeeping, of course, the other 2 principles are, the impartiality of the deployed peacekeeping mission and the non-use of force except in self-defense and defense of the mandate. The issue of whether a country has consented to a peacekeeping mission, I guess, could be seen as quite a simple question, as it can't deploy without it. However, often when we're discussing this concept of host country consent and the way that this discussion around cooperation and working with host countries has been conceived as part of the A4P and the A4P Plus is really looking at this cooperation throughout the mission life cycle when it comes to the mission. So I want to go back to your question there, Richard, about is this a new challenge? And it certainly isn't. You know, history has shown many challenges when it comes to navigating host country consent in peacekeeping missions. We've seen, for instance, the challenges as the UN and the Council has navigated the ups and downs, I guess, of working with Manusma over its deployment over the last 20 years, the work with the level and degree of cooperation in South Sudan. And certainly we've seen instances where host governments have simply decided to kick the UN out. And the example that comes to mind there is certainly MINURCAT and the Chadian government deciding to say, you know, time's up on this mission. But, you know, and this often tends to be a key source of leverage that I guess host countries and host governments particularly have when it comes to peacekeeping. And at the same time, there's often a significant level of international investment in a country in terms of deploying personnel, building facilities, standing up the mission, setting up the elements of the mandate. And what I would also contend, I think, particularly over the last 2 decades, is the way which peacekeeping missions, a number of the multidimensional ones, have protection of civilians at their core. There is simply a reluctance to leave a country where civilians are under threat. And often peacekeeping is the only tool by default that will, you know, there is agreement in going into the country. So there's all these complexities when it comes to navigating host country consent. And on the other hand, when it comes to the host country itself, there is an understanding that when peacekeeping missions deploy, they deploy with a significant amount of financial investment in the economy. They bring a lot of resources to the country, donors, development actors, humanitarian actors that work alongside them. So these are some of the different tensions that we see that are playing out around this sort of issue of cooperation. But I think it's important to say, well, what really are we talking about when we talk about obstructions to host country consent? And I thought it might be helpful to go through a few of the things that we're seeing in missions that are really causing, I guess, a degree of concern at the moment. So, for instance, some of the examples, and I should point out here is certainly that former colleagues at the Stimson Centre, Aditi Guru and also Sophia Sebastian, did some excellent work on this in 2018. But looking at the issue of denial of visas, for instance, the fact that, you know, the host government may decide, we're just going to deny allowing personnel into the country. So while they've consented at that strategic level, there is then that operational denial of allowing personnel to deploy. And this may be either because of the country that they're deploying from, or it may be that they want to deny particular personnel who may be related to a political aspect of the mandate, for instance. And what comes to mind there, for instance, is the police and UNISFA. It may be that they're blocking equipment or transportation or imports that are coming into the country, or applying new taxes, such as taxes on fruit juice or various other things that start to get applied to make it more difficult for the mission to bring certain things into the country. It may be that there's restrictions on movement of personnel, being allowed to travel to parts of the country where part of their mandate is either to observe what's happening in terms of human rights abuses or to observe activities that are taking place. You know, in here, I think, you know, some of the restrictions that we might see in UNIFIL, for instance, or other missions when it comes to implementing parts of their mandate and observing and reporting on what's going on. And I think at the more egregious level, we're talking about attacks on personnel and facilities that may be taking place. So I wanted to highlight, I thought this might be useful to sort of give a sense of where we're up to at the moment. The Secretary General issues a report every year to the UN Special Committee on Peacekeeping Operations, which for anyone who knows is really in the weeds of what the work that the General Assembly does on peacekeeping, but particularly in engaging troop and police contributing countries. And this is one of the things that was stated there, and I quote, "Host governments do not consistently adhere to their legal obligations to cooperate with peace operations and sometimes actively obstruct missions' efforts. This can imperil missions' ability to implement their mandates, endanger the safety and security of personnel, and lengthen the duration of operations." So I thought that was just interesting to give a bit of a snapshot of sort of some of the challenges and the implications of those when it comes to the operation of peacekeeping missions. And I think when we come back to A4P Plus and where peacekeeping is going, a lot of this has to do with mutual trust. You know, one of the things that the Secretariat has started to track at the moment for the instance is to bring visibility around the issues of status of forces violations, to see what's actually happening and report on it, to see if trends are going up or they're going down. And at the moment, they tend to be going up as compared to 2019, for instance. I think there are also other challenges around this issue of host country consent when we consider the complexity of the different actors that are involved in peacekeeping. So immediately what comes to mind here, for instance, is if you look at the deployment of what may be classed as mercenary organisations that are deployed in the Central African Republic, for instance. And what we saw with the Security Council when it adopted a new mandate or renewed the mandate for the UN mission in Central African Republic in November was that Russia and China abstained because they felt that the host government had not been consulted enough on the mandate. And that is the argument that they put forward. So I think at that strategic level, at the major power level, and I know this will be addressed by a number of other colleagues on the panel, there is a lot of tension there. And this issue of around how we navigate the relationship with the host country is going to continue to be an ongoing challenge for peacekeeping missions. Very quickly, as I sort of conclude, I guess, coming back to that question, I probably haven't answered how we address this, and I'm sure this will come up a bit more in the discussion. But I wanted to make an important point here, and this goes to what Bakare was saying there about, I guess, perceptions at the local level and engaging with communities. Because when we talk about consent, often what is overlooked is what consent is given by these communities and their understanding of the work of the peacekeeping mission. It's all good and well to talk about sort of what conversations are happening with the government, but what's happening to engage other parties and what's happening to engage those communities about what the peacekeeping mission is doing and their work. And I think there is a much broader conversation to be had there around that issue. So I'll leave some of my reflections there. I really look forward to the discussion. Sorry, Richard. I think you're on mute.
I think Richard left and is going to try to rejoin. And I think that should be able to fix his mic issue.
Am I back?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. We're working with a new platform for many of us, including myself, and that was bound to happen. Thank you so much, Elisa. That was excellent overview of the obstructions to the host country access. You named denial of visas to taxi on personnel, and started to get into issues I think that many of our panelists will speak to. How do we address one of these fundamental challenges to a core principle, one of the three core principles of peacekeeping? Now, in your own work on protection of civilians, this POC, as it's often known in shorthand, is a core area of most peacekeeping mandates, especially in the last decade or so. It's seen many of us as the key mandate. What are some of the challenges we see in relation to UN missions implementation of this critical POC mandate?
Look, I think that's such an important question, Richard. To build on a little bit of what I was saying there, and I think this goes back to one of the tensions that we've seen with protection of civilians over the last decade in particular. If you look at some of these issues around host country consent, for instance, one of the tensions there has been effectively that a lot of missions are deployed to build up the capacity of the host government when it comes to protecting the civilian population. So building, the capacity of the police to make sure that they are trained and regulated in a manner that understands that civilians are at the core of what they're doing and their work with community policing, ensuring that the security services and the military is abiding by human rights due diligence policies and is, implementing, upholding human rights and abiding by IHL and all these sorts of different things. And then if there are instances perhaps where either through affiliation with the government, or we may not know if it's at the direction of the government, these forces are then responsible for attacks on civilians, that presents a really challenging dilemma for peacekeeping missions in terms of how they respond. Now, if you go back to the guidance that has been developed by the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, In instances where civilians are under attack, regardless of the source of that threat, they are meant to intervene. But of course, you can imagine that at the sort of the strategic level and looking at the relationship, this starts to present a really challenging way of navigating the complexities of, I guess, that work with the host government. So that's one of the ongoing tensions. I think the other is, we've come a very long way, particularly over the last decade when it comes to developing training, developing guidance, developing all these tools that did not exist when the Security Council started mandating missions to protect civilians back in 1999. And I think there's been real strides when it comes to starting to implement training programs and outlining responsibilities and designating accountability for missions when it comes to this. But there is still a long way to go, I think, in terms of making very clear what is expected, what represents good protection of civilians, what are the outcomes that we're looking for. So I think we've seen a considerable amount of progress, and I think a lot of this comes back to, the training and performance of peacekeeping personnel that deploy, the political strategies that are in place in missions and how they support that. So it's a whole of mission effort. And so I think, there is still a considerable way to go to address a number of those challenges, recognizing that it has come a long way over the last few decades as well. So they're just a couple of the things that I'd highlight in terms of ongoing protection of civilians challenges. And the other one, given that it has come up earlier in our discussion about counterterrorism, I would highlight briefly there, I think, as well, is also the challenges of working in mission environments with other actors. So if you are working alongside actors who effectively have their own mandate to deliver or undertake counter-terrorist activity, what implications does that have for the UN when it comes to protecting civilians, and also how the UN is perceived, particularly when it comes to their role and the expectations about what they're doing? And one of the tragic things that we have seen, unfortunately, in Mali in particular, is it has meant that there's been a high degree of attacks given that security environment, and also working alongside some of those actors. So look, there's a whole array of different challenges when it comes to this that I'm sure we'll get into, but they're just a few to highlight at the outset.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. Another major challenge we're going to speak to now, great power competition. Look no further than what we're seeing between Russia and the NATO bloc. So question there in that space for our colleague Hardin, the UN Security Council, as I noted in the outset of this session, has not initiated any new peacekeeping mission in almost a decade, at least 8 years, in part due to disagreement between the Council's powerful permanent 5 members. What, in your view, are the implications of intensifying great power competition for the future of UN peacekeeping and its management of hot wars and especially humanitarian crises? And besides NATO and Russia these days, every night on our daily news stations, China and the US tension comes to mind. What are your thoughts?
Richard, as they say in the Beltway, that's a great question. Thanks very much to you and to PeaceCon and to my other panelists for helping to organize the session. I think it's great and really important. A4P is designed to help make peacekeeping a purpose in the 21st century. And the trend lines that we're seeing suggest that peacekeeping is needed now more than ever. But as you said, Richard, peace ops are winding down, not up, and that needs to change. So I'm going to try to explain a little bit about the why and then try to touch briefly on the how. First, at a strategic level, I think it's important to note that there are more sort of conflicts raging now than at any time since World War II, particularly internationalized civil wars. And these are wars between states and one or more non-state actors where at least one other state has intervened. And nearly all the severe conflicts, and by severe here I'm talking about civilian deaths, but then also the more direct humanitarian implications. All of the major conflicts that are like where the level are quite severe fit into this category. And you have to look no further than, say, Afghanistan, Somalia, Syria, or Yemen, which sort of top the humanitarian list of focus and attention in the coming year to see these examples. And so together with COVID and climate change, these conflicts are driving an explosion in global humanitarian need. And the UN estimates that there are 247 million people who will be in need of some form of emergency assistance this year. This marks a doubling of requirements in the last 4 years. And 41 million people are on the brink of famine, and at least 84 million people have been forcibly displaced. That's more than 1% of the world's population. And against these deteriorating strategic environment, we now, as you said, Richard, have a body of academic evidence that show that peacekeeping is one of the most effective tools we have in managing conflict. The research demonstrates that peacekeepers limit the amount of violence in civil wars, they reduce the number of people killed, the length of the conflict, and in addition, they can actually slow the rate of displacement of populations both inside the countries and across borders. But despite this track record, we're not using the tools. So why is that? And I think great power competition is a big part of it, but there's some other issues that are there up there as well. To begin with, the surge of large complex operations in the knots in the early 2010s really did stretch the system. I was in peacekeeping during this period of time, and it was particularly true of the stabilization missions deployed to Central African Republic and Mali. The result really overtaxed the UN peace and security apparatus. However, in the last couple of years, we've seen a couple of operations shuttered or on track to close. So I'd argue that there is now capacity in the system to do more. Second, there's some real concerns that the major powers may not be interested in investing in new large peacekeeping missions. So COVID-19 has forced the major economies to tighten their belts, and intensifying competition means that great powers have other priorities. But I would argue that peacekeeping is still a really smart investment. Here I'm looking at the United States and other countries. First, it's much cheaper than sending Western troops to deal with a stabilization challenge or a peacekeeping challenge. And second, the price tag for other tools, right, for lessen human suffering like relief aid now are far outstripping the cost of peacekeeping. So for example, if you look at this year's global humanitarian appeal, it's calling for $41 billion in aid, right? That's almost 7 times the peacekeeping budget. And peacekeeping has the ability to sort of slow and stop the conflict in the way that humanitarian aid can't, right? Humanitarian crises don't have humanitarian solutions. So I think it's actually like smart economics and sort of smart from a conflict prevention and resolution perspective to look more to peacekeeping. But third, Richard, you touched on this, the emergence of great power competition really is having a stymieing impact on the multilateral peace and security architecture. As Crisis Group and others have noted, there is now less space for the US and its allies to work with China and Russia to resolve conflict. And we have seen these for years now in places like Syria and Ukraine, and we are witnessing the failure of the Council to address new crises in places like Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, and Myanmar. However, I do think it's important to note that there is an argument to be made that UN peace operations still enjoy a relative consensus among the P5. No doubt, China and Russia are pushing back against traditional liberal norms like human rights, and both are keen to limit more intrusive forms of intervention. But at least China has still seems to view peacekeeping as cooperation. And what's more, recent studies have found that great power competition has yet to really challenge the effectiveness of peacekeeping operations in the field. So for those operations that are actually out there doing business, we're not seeing the impact yet of great power competition and their ability to do their job. I mean, to be sure, both Russia and China are leveraging UN missions to pursue national objectives. It's particularly true for China, now a major troop contributor to peacekeeping. And deployed Chinese contingents are probably collecting intelligence on other militaries. And Beijing has sought to use the deployment of peacekeepers where it has economic interests in places like South Sudan. But on balance, China has yet to really use those peacekeepers or its troops in those blue helmet environments to secure those interests. And for its part, Moscow has used limited TCC deployments to monitor and obstruct peacekeeping mission activities that conflict with its interests. And I mean, I think Lisa just spoke to this. The case of CAR is perhaps the most glaring example. But I would argue that at the strategic level, Russian participation in peacekeeping operations has yet to sort of uniformly disrupt the ability of PKOs to execute their missions. So, my series of sort of recommendations or advice on this would really be more focused on the United States and some other of its Western allies as it looks to how to compete or how it engages in great power balancing and competition, but still tries to firewall peacekeeping off from that to the extent possible. And I think really what we're looking at is an engage and compete strategy on peacekeeping. And I can go into more detail about what that means, because I think there are about 4 or 5 elements or components of this that are critical. Right now, I'll stop there.
Great. No, we want to come to those 4 or 5. Let me note, though, in our wider discussion today, if there's interest from our broader audience, we could bring in, you mentioned Russia in the car and back to Mali, where we started today's conversation, and the role of basically mercenary groups, the Wagner group operating, of course, in Syria, and then this peacekeeping, so-called peacekeeping engagement in Kazakhstan in recent weeks, sponsored by Russia. Now, back to your analysis and very perceptive observations, Hardin, what then should the US and its allies do in response to these trends that you've skillfully outlined? And going, in addition, this is the Alliance for Peacebuilding Community. What kind of constructive ways can we put pressure on our democratic political leaders in a country like the United States, other Western capitals, to nudge the UN in the right direction in support of the Secretary General's A4P plus reforms?
Great, Rich. That's a great question. Again, I think coming back to Carl will be super helpful because it is a really important example in terms of the presence of Wagner on the ground, how it has pursued Russian national interest, but also in support of certain military objectives of the government, and what the interplay has been like with the mission, and including some sort of Russian staff officers who were deployed there. And so there are some lessons to be drawn from that. But I would say the first thing that the U.S. and its allies need to do, and particularly the U.S., is we need to pay our bills, right? The administration needs to pay its UN peacekeeping awards in full. Failure to do so limits American credibility at the Security Council and in peacekeeping discussions. So, if the U.S. is back in the multilateral world in the way in which President Biden has indicated, we have to pay the down payment in order to make that presence really sort of significant. The second thing is, I would say, and here I'm echoing some of your former colleagues at Stimson and elsewhere, we need to put more skin in the game, right? And this means deploying additional staff officers, or even consider putting troop contingents back into peacekeeping deployments on the U.S. side. And U.S. personnel not only make peacekeeping stronger, but it can help balance the presence of Chinese and Russian staff officers and contingents in particular missions. The United States has an interest in limiting the extent to which peacekeeping operations can serve as platforms for competitive behavior, and this will require presence in missions that are at risk of being diverted towards competitor objectives. In the same vein, I would also encourage us to do more to sort of build the bench of qualified staff personnel to participate in UN headquarters, right? So UN headquarters, some of the studies that have been done on this really do identify the Secretariat is the place where the sort of competition is really being felt in more significant ways. And so having a more significant presence inside the Department of Operations, both the military side and lesser civilian, I think can really make a difference in terms of how that engagement is being handled. But third, I would also really encourage the U.S. to look for opportunities, and they're already doing this, to cooperate with Beijing on peacekeeping priorities. Particularly, China has really prioritized the safety and security of UN peacekeepers. We see that in the way in which they manage, force protection in their deployments, and also the way in which they engage the Council and the other entities dealing with peacekeeping inside the UN. So I'd say meeting China where they are on those sets of issues and finding ways to collaborate would be helpful. I would also say that I think it would be very, very helpful for the U.S. to begin to sort of use opportunities for engagement, like the peacekeeping ministerials, like the one that just wrapped up in Seoul, to generate political support for the deployment of new peace operations. These meetings have played an incredibly important role in generating capabilities for current operations. Vice President Biden then, during the Obama administration, helped to launch this. But the United States can also harness the occasion of the peacekeeping summits to build political will from within other member states, including China, to deploy new missions, right, in order to respond to new conflicts. And I think using, really sort of leading on that will be essential to success. And then, the last couple of things here I would say is, on the U.S. side, continuing to invest in the regional alternatives, and we can go into more detail here. That's going to be an essential part of success moving forward. And I think the U.S. could probably also do a little bit of a better job in integrating UN peacekeeping operations into the way it thinks about global fragility writ large. And here I'm talking about the upcoming global fragility strategy. I think if you see the designation of East Africa or the Sahel as an area where the global fragility strategy is going to focus, I think it'd be very important to ensure that the multilateral dimensions of peacekeeping, peacemaking, and conflict resolution, like the peacekeeping missions, are integrated into that strategy so that we're sort of really aligning resources and objectives to the maximum extent possible. I'll stop there.
I counted 5 to 6 excellent recommendations there. Looking forward to your next op-ed on these ideas. And just give a plug here for Partnership for Effective Peacekeeping, very close to the Alliance for Peacebuilding Community with Refugees International, where Hardin is one of their leaders. My organization, Stimson Center, and Lisa is our focal point for that partnership. and United Nations, a foundation. So we hope many of those ideas will be featured prominently in their upcoming activities, which we welcome your involvement. And that first recommendation in particular, let's not ever forget it, pay your bills. You need to pay to play. It should be top of mind for our friends in Congress that carry the purse in the US government decision making. Now, we are going to go back to another region. We're going to come back to sub-Saharan Africa with our final panelist, Daniel. But first, I'm very keen to hear from my colleague, Banu Arjaman, who has been undertaking research on UN peacekeeping missions in West Asia and North Africa, really where peacekeeping found its genesis in the UN context. And this is for research he's undertaking for an upcoming Global Governance Innovation Network policy brief. So Banu, could you tell us a little bit of the most noteworthy achievements and setbacks? I know you've been looking back to the founding of the UN and the earliest peacekeeping missions in your research.
Thank you, Richard. So yes, as Richard said, also just want to say I'm very excited to be here. And as Richard said, I'm sharing some of the research I have recently undertaken along with Professor Karim Makdisi of the American University of Beirut for this new Global Governance Innovation Network policy brief. So since 2014, conflict and fragility have really been on the rise. And more recently, this COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant impact on levels of conflict and violence worldwide. And the level of civic unrest rose in 2020, which was fueled in part by responses to COVID restrictions. I think in total, around 5,000 pandemic-related violent events were recorded between January 2020 and April 2021. So we've seen recently how the fast-spreading pandemic has affected big, small, rich, and poor countries alike, along with fragile and conflict-affected countries, which have come under particularly acute strain. And many of these are situated in the West Asia and North Africa, or WANA region. For instance, the 2021 Global Peace Index states that the WANA region has remained the world's least peaceful region, and it's actually home to the five least peaceful countries in the world, namely Iraq, South Sudan, Syria, Yemen, and Afghanistan. And UN peacekeeping missions, which were pioneered shortly after the world body's establishment, serve as one of the UN's primary tools for maintaining peace worldwide, including in the WANA region, which is one of the world's most challenging regions. So over the next few minutes, I'll share a brief history of the four most notable UN peacekeeping missions in the WANA region. So the first group of military observers, which are known as the United States Truce Supervision Organization, or UNSO, was established in 1948, and they served as the forerunner to modern-day UN peacekeeping. The UNSO military observers work to monitor ceasefires, they supervise armistice agreements, prevent isolated incidents from escalating, and also assist other UN peacekeeping operations in the region. UNSO's mandate is open-ended, and it does not require continuous renewal. And in the WANA region, groups of UNSO military observers are today attached to peacekeeping forces in the area, namely UNDOV, the United Nations Disengagement Observer Force, and UNIFIL, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon. So returning back to the early days of the world body, the United Nations Emergency Force, or UNIF, which was established in 1956, is widely recognized as the first modern peacekeeping mission under a UN flag. And the brainchild at the time of Lester Pearson, who was the Canadian foreign minister from 1963 to 68, UNIF was created to secure an end to the Suez crisis and to supervise the cessation of hostilities, including through the withdrawal of armed forces of France, Israel, and the UK from Egypt. And after the withdrawal, it serves as a buffer between the Egyptian and Israeli forces, and it provides impartial supervision of a ceasefire. So although the notion of using military forces to keep peace wasn't that revolutionary at the time in 1956, the multinational composition of the emergency force, along with its UN mandate, has given it a unique endeavor, gave it a unique endeavor at the time. And UNIF has, in fact, served as a blueprint for all UN peacekeeping operations ever since. And thirdly, is the United Nations Disengagement Observer Force, as I mentioned, UNDOV, which was established in 1974, and it focuses on maintaining the ceasefire between Israel and Syria. It supervises the disengagement of Israeli and Syrian forces and supervises the areas of separation and limitation as provided in the May 1974 Agreement on Disengagement. And since then, the mandate of UNDOV has been renewed every 6 months. Over the years, while recommending the next extension of the mandate, the Secretary General has recently observed that despite the present quiet in the Israeli-Syrian border areas, the situation in the Wana region remains very tense and is likely to continue until a comprehensive settlement covering all aspects of the Wana problem is reached. So with these prevailing circumstances, the Secretary General considered the continued presence of UNDOV in the Wana region to be very essential. And finally, there's UNIFIL, or the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, which was established in 1978 in the aftermath of Israel's invasion into southern Lebanon, and was initially tasked with reestablishing Lebanon's security and governmental authority south of the Litani River. So following the 2006 war between the Iranian-backed Shia militia Hezbollah and Israel, UNIFIL duties and size were expanded to prevent Hezbollah from stockpiling or using arms there. However, the force has not really made significant progress on any of these core security tasks over the past 15 years, and the Security Council should review the force's mandate more frequently and try to hold Lebanese civilian and military officials more accountable for their obstruction. So these 4 operations in the Wana region have manifested neither exit or any achievable goals, and none of them are really aggressively pursuing political processes that might resolve these conflicts that are in question. So based on my research, I've arrived at 3 provisional recommendations for strengthening and rethinking UN peacekeeping in this Wana regional context. First of all, how regional actors such as the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Arab League should petition the Security Council and the UN Secretariat for technical and operational support for joint peacekeeping missions alongside the UN. Second, it's fundamental to use proper benchmarks and indicators to evaluate peacekeeping missions and to understand that their overall effectiveness is not entirely determined by their individual institutional capacities. Rather, that the regional dynamics and the politics of the Security Council matter significantly too. Indeed, the Security Council's decisions, as shown in the cases of Syria and Yemen in recent years, are oftentimes obstructive and counterproductive rather than constructive and proactive. And third and finally, toward enhancing UN capacities to support the responsibility to protect and prevent, the UN should focus on better linking up its widely fragmented and disjointed conflict analysis and crisis warning capabilities. In particular, my STIMS colleagues and I have recommended in recent years a new UN civilian response capability to meet 3 distinct goals. A, improving support for post-conflict institution building grounded in national ownership. B, broadening and deepening the pool of civilian expertise for peace building. And C, enhancing regional, South-South, and triangular cooperation building and sustaining peace. So thank you, and I look forward to any questions and our forthcoming discussion.
Thank you, Bono, especially those very thoughtful and innovative, I would add, concluding recommendations, the new civilian response capability. We got research on all of these ideas that we're eager to share with everybody in the Alliance for Peacebuilding community. And really thankful, Bono, that you gave us the historical perspective on the origins of peacekeeping in the West Asia, North Africa, Wana region, as it's called. But turning back to where peacekeeping has been most active, most resources, most complex with its multidimensional operations. And you're going to hear with our next speaker, politically fraught. That's the Sub-Saharan Africa region. And Daniel, based on your research on, Mali is the biggest mission today, I understand, in terms of size, blue helmets, and of course, big civilian and police components. But MONUSCO has been around for quite a while that's the UN's mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and on a very large scale in such a very large country. So what do you see as some of the key challenges facing contemporary peacekeeping missions based on your research about the Congo? You've done a lot of work directly from Eastern Congo, Goma, in recent years. And what steps can UN missions or the international the international community, more broadly speaking, take to mitigate some of these challenges?
Thanks so much for your question, Richard. It's a very timely one, and to all of you, it's really a pleasure to be here today. So for me, the key challenge facing MONUSCO, as you mentioned, the peacekeeping mission in DRC, is both very, very straightforward and extraordinarily difficult. Namely, how does MONUSCO effectively protect civilians from a broad and to some extent growing range of threats while simultaneously moving towards drawdown and eventual exit? So today, what I'd like to do is to explore this challenge and then offer some recommendations for how the international community and MONUSCO can implement a drawdown process that is safe, inclusive, and effectively prioritizes the protection of civilians, or POC. So first, the context. Today, as many of you know, communities across large parts of Eastern Congo contend with the presence of over 100 armed groups, weak or non-existent state authority, and ineffective or often abusive security forces. Armed conflict has exacerbated a humanitarian situation that can honestly be fairly catastrophic. DRC remains the world's largest hunger crisis, and over 5.2 million Congolese are internally displaced. Moreover, recent efforts to improve the situation, such as l'état de siège or martial law declared by Congolese President Félix Tshisekedi in April, or Ugandan-Congolese joint operations in the Beni region in December, haven't meaningfully improved the protection context. Moreover, hate speech continues to fuel cycles of violence against particular communities, and armed group attacks lead to fresh waves of displacement even over these past few months. So in such challenging circumstances, MONUSCO has a really important role to play. POC is the mission's first priority task, and the mission has really been at the forefront of peacekeeping innovation over its more than 2 decades in the country. Mission tools and activities such as community alert networks through which mission civilians can report threats of violence directly, or intercommunal dialogues meant to ease tensions, or patrols to accompany vulnerable people to gather food are as relevant today as ever. Moreover, in parts of the country, particularly in Turkey and South provinces, for those of you familiar with Congo, IDPs, or internally displaced persons, continue fleeing to mission bases in response to violence. In November, for instance, an IDP camp in Ro in Ituri province grew from approximately 20,000 to 40,000 people in the span of 2 days as civilians fled to the protection of a MONUSCO base. But while MONUSCO remains among the UN's largest missions, it's faced significant pressure to downsize. In 2016, not so long ago, MONUSCO had over 100 bases, field offices across the country, and a troop ceiling of over 19,000. This year, following the expected closure of the field office in Tanganyika in early summer, the mission's activities will be largely limited to 3 eastern provinces, and the mission now has a troop ceiling of 13,500. In consolidating and moving towards exit, the mission has followed directives from the Security Council, including the drafting of a transition plan with the Congolese government this fall. More on that later. So all of that brings us back to the key question. How do you bridge the gap between decreased resources and continuing needs? How do you ensure that a peacekeeping mission, which is in the process of drawing down, effectively protects civilians in a context that's precarious and may well deteriorate in the coming months? Obviously, I can't provide all the answers today, but I would like to offer 5 key recommendations which I think could be quite relevant in other transition contexts. First, the Security Council and the international community more broadly ought to hold MONUSCO and the Congolese government accountable to the transition plan that they published jointly in the fall. The plan includes really ambitious benchmarks on critical subjects, including POC and reductions in human rights violations. Meaningful accountability will require close, regular reporting against benchmarks. And it will also include the Security Council's willingness to pause the transition process if security or the protection of civilians so requires. Secondly, the international community needs to make sure that Congolese civilians are at the center of the mission's transition process. This is something that I'm happy to hear my colleagues have already discussed. As all of you know, civilians are often best placed to understand the protection threats they are facing on the one hand, and to develop and implement strategies to address these problems on the other. In practice, this means pushing the Congolese government and MONUSCO to meaningfully include civilians and civil society organizations, both in monitoring the indicators in the transition plan and in implementing responses to POC challenges. If you want to know whether things are moving in the right direction in terms of POC, you have to ask people who are most concerned. Thirdly, the mission's drawdown or further drawdown must be based on specific assessments of POC that are geographically focused. Today, there are worrisome POC challenges in each of the provinces where the mission is focused. Happy to speak about any of those challenges more. So when you close a base or a field office and the process isn't conditions-based, or which is undertaken for budgetary considerations rather than POC, you run the risk of making fragile contexts even more precarious. Fourth, POC ought to remain the mission's focus during transition. In the recently passed Resolution 2594, the Security Council expressed, and I quote, "the importance of a United Nations presence appropriately configured with necessary capabilities and capacities to provide support to protection of civilian efforts during transitions." In practice, this means that the Security Council needs to maintain POC as the mission's first priority task. It also means that during budgetary negotiations, Fifth Committee delegates ought to make sure that the mission maintains the personnel and resources it needs to implement its POC mandate. I'm happy to speak more about these capacities later. They range from civilian capacities like civilian posts like POC advisors and women protection advisors to air assets and many, many other personnel and resources. Finally, the mission and the international community ought to continue to prioritize early warning and rapid response. As all of you know, all peacekeeping missions struggle to proactively predict, respond, and ideally to prevent threats of violence against civilians. But in a drawdown context, when a mission has reduced physical presence and reduced resources, it's vital that MONUSCO and any mission in transition do two things. One, they need to ensure that they have the means to predict and proactively respond to protect civilians. And two, they ought to take steps to promote the sustainability of these capacities in the long term. Today, civilians in parts of Eastern Congo can pick up the phone and call one of MONUSCO's community liaison assistants to report threats. But the question we need to ask ourselves is, who responds to that phone in the future? And who pays to make sure that phone continues to function? I think I will stop there, but I'm happy to speak about these recommendations in more depth later on, or to discuss ways they may apply to the other peacekeeping missions we've discussed. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Daniel. Excellent overview from such an important country and region of the world. We're going to be heading into Q&A. We have plenty of time for that in a minute, but I'm going to come back to Daniel. But just to say that please continue to use the chat function on this platform for sharing your questions. We're capturing them all, and we're going to be posing them in a minute to our fantastic panelists. Daniel, though, your excellent ideas and insights, very DRC, MONUSCO oriented. I'm sure there's lessons then for peacekeeping writ large, but also drawing on your knowledge about nearby South Sudan and such an important UN operation there, and the most recent, newest UN member state, but going through many difficulties, of course, since independence. Share us your thoughts, for the technical side, but I'd love to hear, what UN member states should be thinking about based on these experiences in these major operations in sub-Saharan Africa, politically, financial resources, ways in which it should be engaging through bodies that give the mandates for these missions, such as the Security Council?
It's a great question, Richard. Very timely. I wanted to go back to a point that Lisa made a few minutes ago. Lisa, you were speaking about the dilemma that peacekeeping missions can face. And one of the ways that we've talked about this at Civic is a sort of paradox between, on the one hand, as a peacekeeping mission, you're often asked to protect civilians. And at the same time, as you mentioned, you are meant to do capacity building and support to government forces in parts of the world where government forces are responsible for a large proportion of human rights violations and IHL violations. DRC is maybe ground zero for this. Often it's about 50-50 between who's responsible for more human rights violations in a given month, armed groups or security forces, but South Sudan really important as well. There's obviously a lot we could dig into here, but I think over the past couple of years, UNMISS has faced more pressure to move towards capacity building and support to the South Sudanese state. And I think, if I want to leave people with one key recommendation, it's really important that when you think about capacity building in a context like South Sudan, on the one hand, you do it in a safe way and you don't deprioritize POC. So I think, and not just in South Sudan, but in other contexts, we can see a sort of competition between physical protection of civilians on the one hand and political engagement on the other, but those shouldn't be contradictions. So even if UNMISS or another peacekeeping mission is moving towards increased capacity building of national security forces, that shouldn't absolve the international community of making sure that its blue helmets are still thinking about the protection that they themselves can provide. So in South Sudan, in recent history, right, the past year, the mission's POC sites, these are called the protection of civilian sites. They're functionally IDP camps, but under the authority and protection of the UN. 4 out of 5 of those have been redesignated, are now under South Sudanese authority. And in certain places, we were in Bentu a couple of months ago, the mission has really moved towards supporting joint police forces. So South Sudan, for those of you who don't know, hasn't graduated. It's probably getting too far into the weeds, but there should eventually be graduated security forces, which come both from the government side and the opposition side. That hasn't happened, but in one particular location, Bentu, which is a very sensitive part of the country, the mission, there's sort of a local arrangement where there's a new joint police force, a national police force that's policing the old protection of civilian sites. And though this is one example, I think it gets to the challenge facing UNMISS, right? So the mission needs, and other international actors need to provide support to security forces that are often very, very, very weak, right? That have no offices, that lack basic materials, including things like rain boots or office supplies. But when you provide support to national actors, you run the risk of facilitating human rights violations. And you also run the risk of hurting your own legitimacy. So it's interesting and something we can hopefully talk about more in the panel. Bakari talked a bit about that legitimacy question, and it's a hard one because on the one hand, in certain contexts we've talked about, civilians want to see more UN support to national security actors, more aggressive operations. But in contexts like parts of South Sudan, where there's really, really widespread mistrust and fear of national security forces, if you provide support to police and those police end up torturing people or committing all sorts of human rights violations, then you risk your legitimacy among civilians who have previously counted on you for protection. So it's a very, very hard balance, and I think a tricky question for the Security Council in the years to come. But I think one thing I'd urge, particularly in the UNMISS context, is to not deprioritize protection of civilians. Even if you think it's important to move towards more capacity building, you never compromise the protection of civilians. I think I will stop there, but happy to dig into this further.
Great, and gave a plug for some of our partners on this call's work, but definitely see the incredible field-based, cutting-edge research by Civic And they're also doing amazing work at UN headquarters with the UN missions. Had an incredible session last week on many of these issues. So now we get to hear the most exciting part of our program from those in the audience. We've had such good feedback. I'm going to have to just read through many of these questions. I'm going to encourage panelists who hear a question that they love to respond to, if they're going to be brief, to also respond. But I'll ferret out these questions to each of you individually based on the points you've made and my knowledge of your own background. And let me just read off the first 5 and who I would love to hear from on each of them. And then we'll go to them in this order. We'll keep our order that we've been going, because we would love to hear back from Bakari. And we have a question about from Gabenga Oni, who is a program officer with the U.S. Institute of Peace. Today is USIP day, as you might have saw in the opening session of the PeaceCon at 10. And Gabenga, she asks to Bakari, how can ECOWAS and the African Union improve on the situation in Mali and CAR? So we're going to go into the wider sub-Saharan Africa region, using regional instruments and how they influence the UN to cede some intervention mandate making to the AU and regional bodies. If I understand, giving more authority to regional bodies in working on peacekeeping and peace building in Mali and CAR. Tell us some more thoughts on the level of cooperation, if not integration, of efforts. Next, we're going to, and so we'll come back to you, Bakari, in a minute. Lisa, we have a question from Gordon Bredick from Civilian Peace Services Canada, an organization you may know of. He says, I spent a year in Kosovo on the UN mission, where I worked on a competency-based methodology to assess and accredit individual professionalism in peace building. Do panelists, so in this case Lisa, see a role in peacekeeping planning for enhanced assessment of suitability for work in conflict environments prior to deployment? From our friend Bob Berg, former chair of the Alliance for Peace Building and a distinguished fellow at Stimson, a question for Hardin Lang from Bob. I would like to hear your views on what to do about having better end games to peacekeeping, the famous exit strategies. It may be that the Security Council doesn't want new missions, since they know they tend to look like eternal commitments. When do we wind down these missions? Knowing you were in Haiti, Hardin, maybe you can share the example of the wind down to a rule of law mission from peacekeeping in recent years. Daniel, we have a question for you from Colin Bickford, who is a public policy grad student at the Duke University School of Public Policy. On the training of peacekeeping missions, what is done to improve or at least address the perceived dysfunction caused by creating peacekeeping forces composed of members from multiple countries with differing level of professionalism and differing cultural norms? So maybe draw on with MONUSCO in mind, what you've observed with the different nationalities of different battalions and their levels of training and then cooperation together. He has a second part question for you, which is regarding the destructive consequence of military intervention. What could be done to better ensure the reemergence of violence is reduced, both parties are kept on a level playing field? And maybe this speaks to the type of robust peacekeeping that DRC MONUSCO has been known for over the years. And then finally for Banu, we have from Mohammed Haq of the Peace and Justice Alliance. Many peacekeeping missions today come from authoritarian countries with problematic human rights records. How can we reconcile this with peacekeeping missions, which are supposed to protect human rights and uphold the rule of law in host countries? So the big question today, dealing with very difficult host countries, especially related to their human rights records. And of course, the UN's central mandate is promoting and safeguarding human rights. Let us begin with Bakari. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It is a general remark. I think that peacekeeping mission will be increasingly compelled to win the war against insecurity and instability, but also in the meantime to win the peace with local population. I think that their credibility and relevance will increasingly depend on their ability to take into account emerging local reality. And they can collaborate with ECOWAS, with the local organization. I think that we have many emerging realities, like the growing role of the local actors, the influence of traditional and religious legitimacy, the great, and in the meantime, as you mentioned, the great fear in the region today is how to avoid the effect of the war of the great power, or opposing those who call themselves Democrat to those who are described as authoritarian. In any case, we can no longer neglect the development of indigenous strategies. These strategies are based on indigenous cultural resources. This strategy makes sense at the level of the local population, and taking them into account will help us to get out of the conflict, of perception of the conflict. And I finish with a general remark related to this question. I think that international partners in the North must understand that our challenges are common. If people there in the North think that what happens in the Sahel is none of their business, they are wrong. Because sooner or later, they will take their share, either with waves of immigration that are difficult to stop, or with shared insecurity. We need to know that we have become a new international community beyond the 5 powerful ones with veto power. We are the international community that shares vulnerability to terrorism and new threats. We are bound by collective security concern, and we have to work together. And as I mentioned in the beginning, in the last years, the role of ECOWAS was neglected in the Sahel. We see the very important role we have gave to the G5 Sahel. And our mistake was to separate West Africa from the rest of the Sahel. And now we are seeing that the spillover and the threat toward the coastal countries. And I finish with this African proverb I love, which says that those who can never part need only go together.
Thank you, Bakari. Wonderful way to conclude. Lisa, the question about competency assessments for peacekeeping, surely they exist. Do they need to be improved? What's your thinking on this important tool?
Thanks, Richard, and thank you for that question. It's a really interesting one to consider. Look, the short answer is, in terms of personnel deploying or civilian recruitment for peacekeeping missions, there are a number of competency criteria and performance expectations before they go into the field. I think there's a couple of points that are worth noting here. One, particularly if we're looking at the troops and the police that deploy to peacekeeping missions, as Hardin alluded to earlier in his comments about the demand that was on peacekeeping, certainly several years ago, we've seen that decline a little bit in terms of the numbers of personnel that are required to deploy in the field. And what that has meant is that I guess there is a degree for more selectivity when it comes to the UN Secretariat determining perhaps which countries and those with which skill sets are able to deploy to missions, which is a position that they may not have been in 5 to 10 years ago, given the demands for peacekeepers. But with that in mind, and I will focus a little bit on the troop and police side in particular, because I think there's some important points here that relate to your question there, particularly around peace building, and that may be particularly of interest. First of all, we know that there are different national approaches, and primarily when personnel are trained up, whether it be in the military and police, they're often trained initially for completely different tasks to what would be expected of them in a peacekeeping mission. So that's a challenge. The UN has developed a range of guidance, whether it be for those working in infantry battalions, through to engineering units, through to on protection of civilians or cross-cutting issues for peacekeepers to be trained on. Now, You asked there whether a lot of that goes into some of the competencies based around peace building. I'm not sure that's a core focus of a lot of the attention, because up until now, a lot of the attention when it comes to advisory and assessment visits, which is what the Secretariat does out to different troop and police contributing countries, has been focused on core competencies when it comes to functioning in the field, what's expected of a military. Not so much necessarily those tasks that you may be talking about community engagement and engaging with other personnel. And I will draw on specifically, I guess, the police as an example here, because often there is an expectation when police deploy to peacekeeping missions, whether they be particularly individual police officers, that they go in ready to train other people, to train other personnel in a range of functions. And often, if you think of anyone in their core job, training is not a core function that you may be equipped for. So there are several gaps in addition to the work, and this is why we see, I guess, the work focused on peacekeeping performance, the work of the Integrated Training Service and the Department of Peace Operations focused on developing a lot of these core training materials that need to be rolled out. But I think there are a lot of gaps when it comes to identifying what that looks like when it comes to engaging with civilian populations around particularly local engagement, working on protection of civilians. There are gaps in a lot of those areas. And one of the real challenges is that often these personnel are only rotating through for 6 to 12 months. So having the ability to develop up those skills in the ways that perhaps their civilian counterparts can, and sometimes I guess there's a greater expectation on civilian counterparts to carry some of that, is much more challenging. And I think the final point I'll make here when we are looking at this in the work of peacekeeping missions and mandates is we often forget that a lot of the individuals who play such an important role in peacekeeping missions are the nationals that are hired to work in the missions, who understand the local terrain, understand the local language, understand the local communities and what's taking place. And I think if you can ensure there's a really good relationship between those that understand those local dynamics and those that are deploying into mission with much needed skill sets that may not be the same, whether they be troops or military, and those different parts of the mission engage effectively, you'll be able to maximize those competencies. But I think there are definitely some gaps there, and you've picked up on them on your question.
Thanks. I clearly shared that question with the right panelist. Harden, this critical question, we should have the next PeaceCon focused on it, exit strategies, endgame for peacekeeping, and I would add in peace building, the peace building architecture, which many people in this community are very much aware of and committed to strengthening, has the same question: when do you graduate a country off of the peace building commission? So yes, what are your thoughts in the realm of peacekeeping, which of course are known to be expensive, let alone complex and politically fraught in the places where they operate?
Richard, great question. Let me just start very quickly by saying I want to respond to some things that are going on in the chat. There's some great work just around the concept of U.S. engagement in peacekeeping through the use of military staff officers. Chris Holshek has put a couple of pieces in the chat, which I think are very much worth looking at. He sort of has led the way on some of this work himself, being out and engaging in missions, and also a great piece by NDU called Doing Well by Doing Good, which is really about sort of how to compete with China and Russia inside the context of peacekeeping, while at the same time really bringing value to the overall endeavor. And I think really there, the comments about the use of military staff officers are spot on, and we draw a lot on that in our own analysis. To your original question about how do we think about end games, I think, and you cited the example of Haiti, right? I think the most important thing, there are two key things. One, the role that the UN can play and the Secretariat can play and the mission can play in engaging with the Security Council. A, be honest, and B, think outside the box. And I say this because in Haiti, the strategy during the noughts, it was very much one of trying to build and strengthen local institutions in the wake of stabilization operations in a way that could help sort of contain some of the dissonance of Haitian politics. That strategy really was not meeting with the kind of success that along the timeline that the major T's wanted to see. So for example, Brazilians were getting increasingly impatient with that approach. And so one of the things that we began to do is sort of look at that and say, we're not sure we're going to be able to get out of here in the timeline that's sort of available to us if we stick to the current strategy. So there was this attempt to sort of reboot and look at really working with the World Bank and then private sector and other partners to sort of begin to generate some economic activity in certain parts of the country to try to shift the general narrative inside the country and show some sort of progress on the horizon moving forward. Now, as that strategy was sort of being put into place, we ran smack into the earthquake in Haiti, and that sort of changed the ability to use that strategy to roll it out. But I would say that those thinking outside the box and also being very honest with the council about where we are in the implementation of the given strategy are essential sort of ingredients to success moving forward. And the final thing I'd say, Rick, there's I saw in the chat about localization of peace efforts, and I would say that there's a lot of really great research that's come out now about a number of the countries in which we're operating. We heard from a number of people on the panel about the importance of prioritizing the local actors outside of the government in the peace process. And I think the role of peacekeeping is really to help create sort of enabling environment and then ensuring that you've got good civil affairs officers on the ground who are capable of interacting with those processes, not driving them, but being sensitive to making sure that the peacekeeping deployments are acting in a supportive fashion to those localized efforts to try to seek peace. Because what we're learning in most of these conflicts is it's not really about top-down efforts, but about local peace builders moving up from the ground. And that's where we're seeing the gains that are going to last over time.
Thank you, Hardin, so much. Daniel, the multifaceted question from Colin Bickford from Duke.
Thanks so much, Colin. It's a really, really interesting question. I think I will start with the second part of your question, which I understood is how missions can stop violence from reemerging. We could talk about that from both the DRC and South Sudan perspective, but maybe just to focus here on non-military responses. I think often when people think about peacekeeping, the main thing that they have in mind is a soldier with a blue helmet. And there's no doubt that those soldiers with blue helmets are vital and very, very important. But in some of the contexts that all of us work in, some of the most important gains in terms of POC and conflict prevention are not military, or at least exclusively military measures. For example, in DRC, the mission is in the process of withdrawing from Tanganyika province, which is in the eastern part of Congo. And we spent a couple of weeks there in the spring. And when we asked people about the main value add of MONUSCO, we didn't hear anything about military operations, and indeed the mission isn't doing military operations in that part of the country. But we heard a lot about intercommunal dialogue, a lot. Tanganyika is a part of the country where there's a lot of localized tensions between different communities. There are tensions between herding and farming communities. And a major part of the mission's value add there, and we met with some of these groups, was creating dialogue groups. Some of them are called barazas. That's really, really important. Secondly, and I think this often also flies under the radar, a lot of the ways that missions respond to POC threats, particularly if they don't have soldiers nearby, is by alerting or putting pressure on national authorities. So sometimes when we hear about abuses by national military forces or national police forces, what civilians are able to do in some areas in Eastern Congo is to share those alerts with national staff. And thanks to Lisa and Hardin for bringing up the vital importance of national staff. Those people can then call national security forces and say, hey, we heard about things we don't like. Can you stop doing this? And this is something we've heard a lot in the DRC as a really critical service that the mission provides, right? Not necessarily sending out troops to a specific area, but putting pressure on national security forces, either to stop doing something or to do something. And then the first part of your question, I know you were talking about training and cooperation between different troop contributing countries. I think Lisa covered a lot of those points really well. But to say from the DRC context specifically, I think what you hear, especially if you speak to civilians or national staff, is a lot of variety between how much training or how much understanding TCC officers come into missions with. One example would be the HRDDP. It's the Human Rights Due Diligence Policy, which is really important. The HRDDP essentially prohibits the UN, any UN body, from providing support to a national security force if there's a substantial risk that it's going to enable violations of international human rights, refugee, or humanitarian law. So it's really critical in the context we're operating in, where missions are often mandated to provide support, but also to protect civilians, provide support to national security forces, that is. So some officers clearly come into peacekeeping missions either with knowledge of the HRDDP or at least a willingness to understand the policy, think about the policy. But on the other hand, we speak to plenty of officers who are really confused about what the HRDDP is, who see it as essentially blocking the UN's work to provide support to national military and police. So this is a really important example of a way that training before missions can make a big difference. You can do some of this during induction training, but you probably can't do all of it. Another example of this is understanding of the CLAs, Community Liaison Assistants. These are national staff piloted by MONUSCO, but now in different peacekeeping missions. So in the DRC context, often you'll have a military base with peacekeepers who almost never speak the local language. And then one or two Congolese officials who are community liaison assistants, who are often, in reality, advising the base commander on what the main POC threats are. Some commanders, and we've spoken to CLAs about this, we've spoken to other staff about this, some commanders come in with a very clear understanding of what CLAs are and how valuable they are. Right? They come into the mission, they're like, you're going to be on a base, there's going to be someone who's Congolese on the base, and you need to rely on her or him in order to get really important information. They're the ones who speak the language, who understand the local context. And then you meet other officials, right, in different missions who may not know what a CLA is, or who may not know that there's a difference between a CLA and an interpreter. So, obviously CLAs and HRDDPs are the HRDDP are just two examples, but I think they speak to the importance of improved training for peacekeepers before deploying to missions. Again, not to say that we don't see lots of good examples, we definitely do, but from my experience, what comes across is often the sort of unevenness. So a lot more we could talk about there, of course.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And see, we're coming up on time, but I'm going to stretch this out 5 more minutes because we have 2 more questions in a minute that we're going to ask Bakari and Lisa to help us with before we round out. But first, Banu, building on this theme of preparing the peacekeeping forces, you have the most difficult question about the human rights training, because many of the peacekeeping providing countries, the troop contributing countries, as they're called, are from authoritarian countries with poor human rights records. How can we get them to focus on the UN's critical safeguarding of human rights role and protection of civilians?
So I think especially in the WANA region, it's very difficult for peacekeeping missions to aggressively pursue political processes in order to solve the conflicts they're facing. But I think there's obviously an argument to be made for the value in their presence and how their removal would cause a lot of issues. And although they can promote stability and reduce the likelihood of hostilities, that's really all about they can do there. And even if the parties in these different countries engage each other violently, the operations don't really have power to do anything about it. So I think it's really necessary and important to hold the governments of these countries more accountable, especially in obstructing Security Council resolutions and failing to protect peacekeepers. And I also think that peacekeeping officials should be more explicit in calling out governments when they are preventing them from implementing their mandates.
Thank you, Banu. And as promised, 2 more quick questions. I hope brief answers. Bakari, we're super happy to have a former colleague of ours, Christina Petku, who's quite familiar with your country of Mali and wider region, and has a question about the signatories of the peace agreement have constantly accused the transition government of Mali of not moving forward with the implementation of the peace agreement? It seems like the government is rather focused on fighting terrorism. What should Manusma do to better ensure that both the government and the armed groups signatories to the agreement continue to engage and make progress on this peace agreement's implementation? And then finally, Lisa, we haven't heard today about the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, and I would also tack on the Youth Peace and Security Agenda that's been inspired by WPS. What, if any, relationship do they have to modern day peacekeeping? If there is a connection in terms of the mandates of these peacekeeping missions, how can it be strengthened? Bakari. Oh, we need you off of mute. Please put your audio back up. Bakari, yeah, there you go.
I'm okay. I'm with you. Okay. I think that the major challenge in the rule of law today is to emerge blameless from the constraint of managing the imperative of security and respect for the human rights. But in this specific case of Mali, I think that we should not reverse the order of priorities. The actual authorities in Mali were not elected. And I think the priority in Mali is now to restore the rule of law, restore the constitutional order first. And after that, because if we sign some peace agreement with an illegitimate, democratically government, we'll have other problems that will emerge in the future. So in Mali, I think now it is difficult for ECOWAS, for African Union, with the multiplication of the case, like Guinea, like Burkina Faso today. But I think that in spite of all the noise we can hear about French presence, the Wagner, Russia, the priority is now to restore the constitutional order and to push the peace process moving in a coordination with all the international actors, partners in Mali, with the leadership of the United Nations and in close collaboration with the African Union, with the ECOWAS, and in a kind of synergy. But I think that it is very important to do that. We want peace in Mali, but we have to restore the constitutional order and to solve this very important crisis and to avoid that the situation in Mali became a kind of example to copy in other countries if you don't want to put the region, the world region, in an era of instability. We can solve first the national problem, to restore the constitutional order, and after to put